Imagine spending $200,000 on a smart home system that adjusts your lighting, monitors your air quality, and regulates temperature room by room. Now imagine that families in Kyoto were doing something remarkably similar over 400 years ago, with wood, paper, and packed earth. That was the 1500s. By the time the rest of the world caught up to ideas like passive cooling, flexible room layouts, and biophilic design, Japanese builders had been refining those exact principles for centuries. How does an entire architectural tradition get that far ahead, and then get almost completely overlooked? The answer comes down to 11 specific home features. Most of them vanished from modern construction. A few survived only in rural farmhouses and old temple grounds. And almost every single one of them solved a problem that architects today are spending millions trying to crack. Number 1. The Genkan. Walk into almost any modern Western home and you step straight from the sidewalk onto the same floor where people eat, sleep, and sit. The boundary between outside and inside is a door, and that is about it. Traditional Japanese homes handled this completely differently. The Genkan was a sunken entryway, a small recessed area just inside the front door that sat several inches below the main floor level. You stepped down into it from outside, removed your shoes, and then stepped up onto the raised wooden floor of the house. That single level change did more work than most people realize. It created a physical barrier that kept dirt, mud, and moisture from ever reaching the living space. But it also created a psychological one. Stepping up into the home was a deliberate act. You were crossing a threshold, leaving the outside world behind. Guests would pause in the Genkan, announce themselves, and wait to be greeted. The homeowner would come to meet them there. It was a decompression zone between public life and private space. And the part that gets architects excited today is that it actually worked on a hygienic level that Western entryways still do not match. Studies on indoor air quality in Japanese homes have consistently pointed to the Genkan as one reason traditional Japanese interiors stayed cleaner with less effort. The raised floor kept the living space separated from ground-level dust and insects. No fancy filtration system needed. The Genkan also had a social function that went beyond hygiene. The size and decoration of the entryway told visitors immediately about the household's status. A merchant's Genkan in Edo period Osaka would feature polished stepping stones and a carved wooden shoe cabinet. A farmer's Genkan might be bare earth with a simple wooden ledge. Either way, you knew where you stood the moment you walked in. Most modern Japanese homes still have a Genkan. Most Western homes still do not. And every mudroom renovation you have ever seen is basically trying to reinvent something that Japanese carpenters figured out before Shakespeare was born. Number 2. The Ranma. Here is a problem every old house faces. You need walls to divide rooms, but walls block airflow and light. In a country where summer humidity can be brutal, sealing rooms off from each other is a recipe for mold, stale air, and misery. Japanese builders solved this with the Ranma, a decorative transom panel installed in the gap between the top of a sliding door and the ceiling. These were open or semi-open wooden panels, often carved into elaborate designs of waves, birds, mountains, or abstract geometric patterns. They looked like art. They functioned like ventilation systems. Air moved freely between rooms through the Ranma, even when the sliding doors below were shut. Light filtered through the carved openings and cast intricate shadow patterns across ceilings and walls as the sun moved during the day. And because they sat above head height, they did all of this without sacrificing privacy. The craftsmanship on some of these panels was extraordinary. In wealthy households and temples across Kyoto, a single Ranma could take a master woodcarver weeks to complete. The panels in Nishi Honganji Temple in Kyoto are considered national treasures. Centuries of visitors have stood underneath them, and they are still functioning exactly as they were designed to, moving air through rooms that were built over 400 years ago. There were different styles, depending on the region and the wealth of the household. Some Ranma were simple rows of vertical wooden slats. Others featured elaborate pierced carvings of pine trees, cranes, or flowing water. The most expensive ones were layered, with three-dimensional scenes carved from a single block of hinoki cypress. Each style balanced airflow against decoration differently, but they all solved the same problem. Most modern homes solve the ventilation problem with electricity. The Ranma solved it with geometry and a saw. But the Ranma was not the only feature keeping the air moving inside a traditional Japanese home. Number 3. The Irori. In the center of many traditional Japanese farmhouses sat a square pit cut into the wooden floor, lined with stone or clay, and filled with ash and glowing charcoal. This was the Irori, the sunken hearth, and it was the heart of the house in every sense. The Irori heated the home during winter. A hook and chain called a jizaikagi hung from a thick ceiling beam above the hearth, holding a cast iron kettle or cooking pot over the embers. The hook could be raised or lowered to control the heat. Families gathered around the Irori to eat, talk, work, and sleep. In a farmhouse with no central heating, the Irori was the one warm spot, and everything in the home oriented around it. But here is the detail that most people overlook. The smoke from the Irori drifted up through the open room and into the thatched roof above. And that smoke was not just a byproduct, it was maintenance. The slow, steady stream of warm smoke coated the wooden beams and the thick straw thatch overhead, preserving them against insects and rot. The same fire that heated the house and cooked the food was also protecting the building itself from decay. You can still see Irori in preserved farmhouses in the Shirakawa-go region, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in the Japanese Alps. The massive Gasho-zukuri farmhouses there have steeply pitched roofs that have lasted well over 100 years, and the Irori smoke is one of the reasons why. Visitors who step inside those farmhouses can still smell the centuries of charcoal that saturated every beam in the ceiling. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything about how Japanese homes worked as complete systems. The Irori did not operate alone. It worked with the thatched roof above it, the earthen floor area beside it, and the ventilation openings throughout the house. Remove any one piece, and the others stopped functioning correctly. The house was a machine, and the Irori was its engine. Number 4. The Doma. Step into a traditional Minka farmhouse, and you would notice something strange right away. Part of the ground floor had no wooden floorboards at all. Instead, there was a section of hard-packed earth sitting at the same level as the ground outside. This was the Doma, and it occupied a surprisingly large portion of the home. The Doma was the working zone of the house. This is where families cooked over open flames, stored farming tools, kept livestock during harsh winters, and did any work that was too messy or too dangerous for the raised wooden living area. It sat right next to the elevated tatami rooms, connected by a single step up, so moving between work and rest happened dozens of times a day without thinking about it. The genius was in what it prevented. Fire was a constant threat in wooden homes. Cooking over an open flame on a wooden floor is an obvious disaster waiting to happen. The earthen floor of the Doma was fireproof. Sparks, spills, and fallen embers just landed on packed dirt. The Doma also stayed naturally cool in summer because the earth floor conducted heat away from the surface, and it stayed warmer than the outside air in winter for the same reason. The thermal mass of packed earth worked as a passive temperature regulator decades before anyone used that term. In some farmhouses, the Doma took up nearly half the total ground floor area. The Doma sat right beside the family's living quarters with no door between them, fully part of the daily rhythm of the household. The boundary was just that single step, the same principle as the Genkan applied inside the house itself. Western architecture drew hard lines between workspaces and living spaces. The Doma erased that line, and it did it safely. Everything we have covered so far was practical, engineering solutions to engineering problems. But the next feature on this list goes somewhere different entirely. Number 5. The Engawa. This is the one that modern architects cannot stop talking about. The Engawa was a wooden corridor that wrapped around the outside of a traditional Japanese home, sitting under the wide eaves of the roof. It was covered, usually floored with smooth wooden planks of polished cedar or cypress, and it ran between the interior rooms and the garden. The Engawa belonged to both worlds at once, interior and exterior, without fully committing to either one. During warm months, the sliding shoji screens on the interior side could be pushed open, and the Engawa became an extension of the living room. The garden flowed into the house. The breeze came through. The boundary between architecture and nature essentially disappeared. Families sat on the Engawa to watch the rain, drink tea in the afternoon light, or simply let the children play between the house and the garden without worrying about the transition. During cold months or rain, the screens closed and the Engawa became a sheltered buffer zone. It trapped a layer of air between the exterior walls and the living space, acting as natural insulation. Rain hit the eaves and ran off well before it reached the Engawa floor. Snow piled up in the garden while the wooden corridor stayed dry and walkable. The Engawa also controlled light. The wide, overhanging eaves above it blocked the high summer sun from entering the rooms directly, keeping interiors cool. But in winter, when the sun hung lower in the sky, the light passed under the eaves and flooded the rooms with warmth and brightness. The depth of the eaves was calculated for the latitude. A house in southern Kyushu had different eave proportions than a house in northern Tohoku because the sun angle was different. No thermostat, no automated blinds. Just an understanding of how sunlight angles change with the seasons, built permanently into the shape of the house. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. The Engawa influenced how every room behind it felt, looked, and breathed. Number 6. The Tokonoma. In the main room of a traditional Japanese home, one section of wall was recessed slightly, creating a shallow alcove. This was the Tokonoma, and it was the single most important design element in the room, even though it was almost always nearly empty. That sounds like a contradiction, but hear it out. The Tokonoma held one scroll painting, called a kakejiku, and one flower arrangement, called an ikebana. Sometimes just the scroll, sometimes just a single branch in a vase. The point was restraint. In a culture that treated empty space as an active design choice rather than a failure to fill it, the Tokonoma was the purest expression of that philosophy. The scroll and the flowers changed with the seasons. A winter Tokonoma in a wealthy Kyoto residence might hold a painting of snow-covered mountains and a branch of red camellia. A summer display might be a calligraphy scroll about coolness paired with a single white lily. An autumn arrangement could feature a branch of burning red maple leaves in a rough ceramic vase. The Tokonoma set the emotional tone for the entire room, and it reset that tone every few weeks as the natural world shifted outside. The host chose the display to honor their guests. A visitor to a Japanese home would look at the Tokonoma first, the same way a visitor to a Western home might look at a painting above the fireplace. But where the Western painting stays on the wall for years, the Tokonoma was alive. It was a conversation between the homeowner, the season, and the guest, and it happened in a space barely larger than a closet. I mean, think about that for a second. Modern interior design spends enormous energy trying to make rooms feel intentional and curated. The Tokonoma achieved it with a recessed wall and a vase. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. So, everything we have covered dealt with practical engineering and aesthetic philosophy. But what Japanese builders did with their most utilitarian structures made even the storehouses worth studying. Number 7. The Mushiko-Mado. Traditional Japanese storehouses, called kura, had a serious problem. They needed to be sealed against fire, theft, and weather. Thick walls of clay and plaster, sometimes over 30 centimeters deep, made them nearly fireproof, which was critical in cities where wooden buildings burned regularly. But sealing a building that tightly meant the air inside went stagnant, and stagnant air meant moisture buildup. And moisture meant everything stored inside, from rice to silk to family records, could rot. The Mushiko-Mado was the fix. These were small, barred window openings set into the upper walls of the storehouse, covered with a lattice of vertical wooden or metal bars. They were tiny, sometimes no wider than a forearm span, and they sat high enough on the wall that reaching them from outside was nearly impossible. The name translates roughly to insect cage window, because the tight lattice bars looked exactly like the small wooden cages that Japanese families used to keep suzumushi, the singing bell crickets they brought inside during autumn. The resemblance was so obvious that the name stuck, and somehow it gets worse for modern engineers because these little openings solved the ventilation problem completely. Warm, stale air inside the kura rose to the top of the sealed space and escaped through the Mushiko-Mado. Cooler air was pulled in at the base of the walls through narrow gaps in the foundation stones. The storehouse breathed, slowly and constantly, without ever compromising its defenses against fire or break-ins. Passive stack ventilation. That is the modern engineering term for what the Mushiko-Mado was doing. Today, it requires computer modeling to optimize airflow rates and opening sizes. 400 years ago, it required a carpenter who understood that hot air rises. Number 8. The shoji. Most people have seen these, the sliding screens made of translucent white paper stretched over a wooden lattice frame. They show up in every film set in Japan. But almost nobody talks about why they were actually brilliant as an engineering choice. The paper used was washi, a handmade paper produced from the inner bark of the kozo mulberry plant. Washi is tougher than it looks. A well-made sheet could last a year or more before needing replacement, and replacing a panel cost almost nothing compared to repairing a glass window or a solid wooden wall. The homeowner just peeled off the old paper, applied fresh rice paste, and laid on a new sheet. The entire room got a visual refresh for the price of a single sheet of paper. But the real function was light. Glass windows create hard beams of direct sunlight that produce glare, hot spots, and deep shadows. Washi paper does the opposite. It scatters incoming light evenly across the entire surface, filling the room with soft, diffused brightness that reaches every corner without creating a single harsh shadow. Photographers today pay hundreds of dollars for studio diffusion panels that replicate what a shoji screen did for virtually nothing. Shoji also absorbed and released moisture from the air. In humid summers, the paper pulled water vapor out of the room. In dry winters, it released moisture back. A subtle, passive humidity regulation system built into the walls themselves. And there was a practical side that people rarely mention. Unlike a glass window or a solid wall, a shoji screen could be removed entirely. Pull the screens out of their tracks, and the wall vanished. A 4-room house became one large open hall. Put the screens back, and the rooms returned. The home was modular centuries before modular became a design buzzword. The choice of washi over glass shaped everything else about how light, air, and moisture moved through a Japanese home. Every other feature in this list operated differently because of it. Number 9. The Amado. If shoji screens were delicate, they needed a bodyguard. The Amado was that bodyguard. These were heavy wooden storm shutters that slid along tracks mounted on the outside of the Engawa. During calm weather, the Amado panels stacked neatly into a compact storage box at one end of the corridor, called a tobukuro, completely out of the way and invisible. When a typhoon or heavy rainstorm approached, the household pulled the panels out of the box one by one and slid them along the track until they locked together, forming a solid wooden wall around the entire exterior of the house. The shoji screens, the Engawa, the garden views, all of it disappeared behind a fortress of thick cedar planks. The house sealed itself. Rain hammered the Amado. Wind pressed against them. And behind them, the paper screens and wooden interiors stayed completely dry. And when the storm passed, the homeowner pushed the panels back into the tobukuro one by one, and the house opened up again. Light, air, and the garden view returned in a matter of minutes. You would think someone would have said something about how elegant this system was. Nobody did, at least not in Western architectural circles, until very recently. The concept of a home that can switch between fully open and fully sealed in minutes is now showing up in modern hurricane-resistant design along the American Gulf Coast and in typhoon-prone regions of Southeast Asia. Architects have started studying traditional Japanese storm shutter systems as a reference for what they call adaptive building envelopes, structures that change shape in response to weather conditions. The Japanese had this sorted out during the Edo period. The rest of the world is still writing research papers about it. Number 10. The Tsuboniwa. Japanese cities have always been dense. In Kyoto and Osaka, merchant homes called machiya were built long and narrow, squeezed between neighboring buildings on tight urban lots. The front of the house faced the street, the back stretched deep into the block, and the rooms in the middle of that long, narrow floor plan had no access to outside air or natural light at all. The Tsuboniwa fixed this. It was a tiny courtyard garden, sometimes no wider than 2 meters across, cut into the middle of the house like a skylight made of plants and stone. These miniature gardens pulled fresh air down into the interior of the building through a natural chimney effect. Warm air inside the house rose and escaped over the rooftop. Cool air was drawn down through the open Tsuboniwa to replace it. Light reached rooms that would otherwise have been permanently dark. And in a dense city block where privacy from neighbors was impossible through windows, the Tsuboniwa gave families a private view of nature that nobody else could see into. The plantings were carefully chosen for the conditions. Moss, ferns, a single stone lantern, maybe a small Japanese maple tree that turned red in autumn. Every element was scaled to fit the tiny space. A stone water basin might sit at the base, no larger than a dinner plate, collecting rain. The effect was that of looking into a world that felt much larger than it actually was. A well-designed Tsuboniwa in a Kyoto machiya could make a 2-meter gap between walls feel like a forest clearing. Modern architecture calls this biophilic design, the integration of natural elements into built environments to improve occupant well-being. The research supporting it is barely 20 years old. The Tsuboniwa has been doing it for over 500. Number 11. The Tsukubai. Outside the entrance to a tea room in Kyoto, set low to the ground and fed by a thin bamboo pipe called a kake, sat a stone water basin called a Tsukubai. To use it, you had to bend down, kneel, even. A wooden ladle rested across the top for scooping water. That was the entire point. The word Tsukubai comes from the verb tsukubao, meaning to crouch or bow down. Before entering a tea ceremony, every guest, whether they were a feudal lord carrying 2 swords or a common merchant from the market district, had to lower themselves to wash their hands and rinse their mouth. It was a physical act of humility. The basin did not rise to meet you. You went down to it. This was designed in the 1600s, during an era when social hierarchy governed nearly every interaction in Japanese life. The tea master Sen no Rikyu, who shaped much of what the tea ceremony became, insisted that the doorway into the tea room, called a nijiriguchi, be built deliberately small, barely 70 centimeters tall, so that even samurai had to remove their swords and crawl through on their knees. The Tsukubai outside reinforced the same idea. By the time you sat down for tea inside the small, bare room, you had already physically lowered yourself twice. Status stayed at the gate. The basin itself was often carved from a single rough stone, deliberately left unpolished, deliberately imperfect in keeping with the wabi-sabi aesthetic that valued age and natural wear over pristine surfaces. Water trickled into it from the bamboo spout and overflowed gently over the rim into a bed of river pebbles below. The sound of that water was part of the design. It was meant to clear the mind the same way the physical act of bending cleared the ego. One of the most famous Tsukubai in Japan sits at Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto. It is carved with 4 kanji characters that, when read together with the shared center radical, form a Buddhist saying that translates roughly to, "I learn only to be contented." Visitors have been reading those characters and washing their hands at that basin for over 300 years. A stone, some water, and a bamboo pipe. That is all a Tsukubai is. And it solved a problem that boardrooms, conference halls, and luxury hotels still have not figured out, which is how to make every person who walks through the door feel equal before anything begins. The traditional Japanese home was not a collection of features. It was a system where every piece depended on every other piece, and removing one changed how the rest performed. The Engawa controlled light because the eaves were angled for the sun. The Irori preserved the roof because the thatch was designed to absorb smoke. The Shoji regulated humidity because the Genkan kept outside moisture from ever reaching them. The Amado protected the Shoji because the Engawa gave them a track to run on. These 11 features are not relics from a lost world. They are blueprints that modern design is quietly rediscovering, one conference paper and one luxury renovation at a time. And the fact that each rediscovery gets treated as an innovation is probably the strongest proof that they were never outdated in the first place. If you found this one interesting, the video on screen goes deeper into how ancient builders solved problems we still struggle with today.